Welcome to week 2 of AP Psychology. I already posted one of these PowerPoints, however, apparently the sound did not connect after the first 5 minutes. I'm so sorry to hear that. So here I am trying to do it again. We'll make it all work. It's all going to work out fine. Alright, well here we are, week 2, History and Perspectives. Let's get started. So as we get through going through this entire process, history and perspectives this week is we're going to start talking about things that we will be discussing throughout the whole year. So the concepts found this week are major thoughts, ideas, categories we'll be talking about throughout the year. Okay? So here's some simple true-false questions. You are born with all the brain cells you will ever have. True or false? The answer is false. Okay. Recent research shows that some parts of the brain continue producing new cells throughout our lives. This is one of the major concepts we'll be talking about this year and is a psychology question. Both center patches are the same shade of gray. True or false? Answer is true. Same color. How is this a psychology question? Sensation and perception. We're going to get into all this information. Okay? So, they are the same color. Alright? This just explains darker because of the perceptual contrast, sensation, and perception. Intelligence is purely a genetic trait that does not change throughout a person's life. True or false? The answer is false. Intelligence is a result of heredity and environment. You can actually change your intelligence throughout. We're going to talk about this. Intelligence is one of those things we will be focusing in week 8. The most common form of mental disorder occurs in 30% of the population. True or false? Some of you may be surprised, but this is true. Depression, the most single common disorder. We'll be going into much more detail when we talk about disorders as well as treatments for these disorders. Another psychology question. Okay, so all of those concepts that we just talked about, those true-false questions, cover a huge spectrum of different concepts in psychology. So what is psychology? Psychology is a broad field with many specialties, but fundamentally, psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes. Please keep in mind that this is not a philosophy. This is a science. We use math, we use science, we use the scientific method in order to prove all of our theories. So what is psychology and what's it not? Psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. It is not merely speculation about human nature. We're not guessing here. We're looking for facts. We're looking for proof. Okay? We don't believe that anything that everyone believes to be true is true. We believe in the facts. What stands alone? What can be proven time and time again? Okay? So psychology disputes unfounded claims from pseudo-psychology. Okay? What that means is we're trying to prove any statement we make. Any statement we do make, we actually can scientifically state over and over again how it's true and why. Pseudopsychology is erroneous assertion of practices set forth as being scientific psychology. What is it? It's fake psychology. It's people saying, oh, well, we do things this way because of this. Well, if people make those claims without any science behind it, without any proof, then that would be fake psychology. So what do psychologists do? Psychologists aren't just people sitting next to couches asking people how is their day, how are they feeling. Psychologists are found all over in our lives. Psychology is a broad field with many specialties grouped in 3 major categories: experimental psychology, teaching of psychology, and applied psychology. We're going to talk about what each of those 3 major categories are and what those people actually do. Okay? So, experimental psychologists, they conduct most of the research across the psychological spectrum. If we're trying to figure out why do girls group together in social situations, the experimental psychologists are the ones going to be testing that theory. Okay, they're the ones going to be sitting out there doing the research, having the hypothesis, processing through, working through, and coming up with the conclusions. Okay, most of these experimental psychologists work in private industry or for the government. The government is one of the largest employers of psychologists in the United States. All right, often teach at colleges or universities. Typically, when you have a college professor of psychology, typically they're doing research, especially at the big acclaimed research colleges like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford. Those are typically experimental psychologists who are carrying out their own psychology experience as well as teaching. All right, applied psychologists. They use psychological development by experimental psychologists to solve human problems. So we have the experimental psychologists who are coming up with the research. The applied psychologists are the ones who are taking all that information and giving it to the people who need it the most, okay, to solve human problems. There is 7 different types of applied psychologists. We're going to be discussing those at a further detail. Okay, so what are psychology's historical roots? Okay, modern psychology developed from conflicting traditions, including structuralism, functionalism, result psychology, behaviorism, and psychoanalysis. Now, if you don't know what these are, that's fine. We'll be spending plenty of time in class discussing these, comparing, contrasting, and talking about the focuses of each of them. Okay, so, but just giving you a brief introduction. What is structuralism? Structuralism is devoted to uncovering basic structures that make up the mind and thought. Okay, so this is all about trying to figure out how we think through things. Structuralism. It's one of the foundations of psychology. Functionalism was created in reaction to structuralism, believed mental processes could best be understood in terms of their adaptive purpose and function. So structuralism believes that we are just trying to understand how we think through problems. Functionalism is how not only do we think through problems, but how does our mind adapt to certain situations. Result psychology is interested in the construct of perceptual wholes. Our mind is a brilliant creation that likes to fill in the gaps and make whole, complete thoughts. Okay, result psychology is how our mind takes partial information and makes it a whole thought. Behaviorism argued psychology should deal solely with observable events. Okay, that psychologists should not spend their time thinking of what people are thinking, but actually focusing on what they're doing, because we can scientifically measure and observe what they're doing instead of anticipating what they're thinking. And psychoanalysis, created by Sigmund Freud, asserted mental disorders arise from conflicts in the unconscious mind. Now, once we get to psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud, then we really start discussing the conscious and the unconscious mind, okay, and the conflicts between the two. So what are the perspectives? Okay, we just talked about the traditions, the structures, okay. What are the perspectives? There's 7 main perspectives of characterize modern psychology: the biological, developmental, cognitive, clinical, behavioral, trait, and sociocultural views. Okay, what this does, it takes into mind all of the things that we think, do, and puts them in one perspective or one train of thought. Okay, so the 9 modern perspectives of psychology, let's start talking about them individually. The biological. It views human nature that we're a complex system to respond to heredity and environmental influences, which means that our body's chemical sciences, our mixing of hormones and all that dictate our entire responses, thought processes, and all of our behaviors is dictated by our biological needs. What determines our behavior is our neural structures, our biochemistry, and our inborn responses to external cues. Okay, so all of the things that our body's chemistry is doing dictates what our behavior is telling us to do. So the question, what we're going to be focusing on throughout the year, is how do our heredity, our nervous system, our endocrine system produce behavior and mental processes? How does our body's chemistry maintain and change our body's thinking process and thought process? Okay? Developmental, we undergo predictable patterns that change throughout our lives. Okay? We're all born, we're all newborns, we all turn into children, then we go into teenagers, then we go into young adults, then we go into our mid ages. Those are predictable patterns of changes. At every single pattern, our body changes, our desires change, our needs changes, our expectations changes. Okay? So what determines our behavior in the developmental perspective? Interaction between heredity and environment. Okay? These two mixes dictate how we feel, how the world works, how we see the world in our own thoughts. Okay? So, what we're going to be answering throughout the year is what are the patterns that characterize developmental change? Okay? What are genetic and environmental influences underlying these patterns? We say that both heredity and environment affect our development, but to what depth? How much does our environment affect our own change throughout our lives? And that's what we're going to try to answer. The cognitive perspective, people are information processing systems. The cognitive believes that our brain is constantly working and pulling out information and using that information, and that our cognitive perspective allows us to continually to evolve. So what is it? Our mental interpretation of our experience dictates our behavior. So the more information we have, the more our behavior changes. Okay? So how do mental processes, sensation, perception, learning, memory, and behavior all influence how we act? This is the more information we have change our behavior, or what impact does our learning and our memory have? That's the type of questions cognitive perspective tries to answer. The psychodynamic, we are driven back by dark forces of the unconscious. Back to Freud, okay? Our conscious mind and our unconscious mind are continually in flux, trying to influence our behavior, and the unconscious has a truly large effect on our thoughts and our behavior, and psychodynamic perspective is trying to figure out how much. All right, so what determines our behavior? The unconscious needs, conflicts, repressed memories, and childhood experiences. Okay, so how much influence do those have on our behavior? How does the energy generated for the unconscious mind motivate our actions and account for mental disorders? We're trying to figure out who really has the power in our mind, the conscious or the unconscious. The humanistic perspective emphasizes human growth and potential. The thing that makes us different from any other animal, beast on earth is our ability to reason, and the humanistic perspective believes our potential is what makes us different and dictates our behavior. All right, so our own ability to see our self-concept, our perceptions and interpersonal relationships, and our own desire for personal growth is what dictates our behavior. That we want to improve, we want to be better. That's what makes our behavior different. Okay, so what we're going to be trying to answer is how can humanistic theory be applied to enhance mental health through counseling and therapy? This desire of potential and growth, how can we use it to enhance counseling and help people who have serious disorders? Now, behavioral therapy, behavioral perspective, is primarily shaped by learning. We learn how to behave. You were taught how to behave in Miss Reeves' class. You were taught how to behave on the baseball field. You were told how to behave in a library. So our behavior is dictated by what we learned. Okay, so what determines behavior? Are stimulus cues in our history of rewards and punishment. If you walked into my class on the first day yelling and screaming and being rude and disruptive, you would have been punished by a comment or a moving of your chair or something to that effect. You wouldn't have wanted that, and you would have learned your lesson not to be acting out in class. A stimulus cue, okay, is the dictation of what the behavior is expected. Okay. So questions for study. What are the laws that associate our responses with stimulus conditions? So what makes us know what behavior is expected and what's not? Is it our physical background? Is it our social connections and cues? Or is it internally we know how the behavior which we're supposed to act? Now, the sociocultural perspective, people are social animals. So human behavior must be interpreted on a social context. What that means is that humans are not supposed to be alone. We need to have other people. We interact. We need that interpersonal connection. Okay? So our behavior is dictated by keeping us in the social graces of others. Okay? So what determines our behavior? Culture, social norms, expectations, and social learnings. Okay? We want to be included. We want to be a part of our culture. We want to be a part of the social connections. So what are we going to focus on? Understand under what conditions is the social and cultural situation predictive of our behavior. If everyone in our school all of a sudden turns up tomorrow wearing red, all right, is by the end of the week, is every student in our school going to be wearing red? Who knows? What are the social influences across culture? The evolutionary socio-biological believes that behavior's developed over time. That this perspective believes we go all the way back to the cavemen in our evolution from the cavemen to now. That our behavior has been adapted, but it has strong roots in our caveman background. Okay? What determines our behavior is natural selection. All right? Obviously, the weaker genes have died off. The genes we have now clearly allowed us to survive during those times. So natural selection plays a huge impact on our behavior. And questions for study: how does behavior and individual differences develop and change? If we have all evolved from this caveman, shouldn't we be more similar? And if we should be more similar, then why aren't we more closely tied to each other's social norms? Okay? And trait. Individual differences result in differences in our underlying pattern of stable characteristics. They call it trait perspective. I would like to think it's personality perspective. I think it makes a lot more sense. Personality perspective deals with how our own stable characteristics of our personality affect. Now, if you're always a nervous, uncomfortable person and all of a sudden you're put into a very tense situation, you're going to deal with it pretty terribly. If you're a very low-key person, you put in a high-stress situation, your personality is going to change, but so much. So, what determines behavior? Each person's unique combination of traits. Okay, your personality dictates how you handle behavior, how you handle external events. Okay, so questions: how many fundamental traits are there? How can we use trait patterns to predict behavior? How can we use our personality to determine our behavior in future situations? That's what trait perspective is trying to identify. Now, here's some major characters in psychology who are studying and who are a part of psychology and who will be playing a huge role throughout the whole course of the year. Now, William Wundt is the father of modern psychology. He is the first one who started a laboratory to science. Okay, he is a German man who was the first to really begin a laboratory. He believed that psychology was the scientific study of conscious experiences. Now, before Wundt in his first laboratory, psychology was a philosophy. Okay, people theorized about it, but there was no science behind it. William Wundt was the first one to push for it to be its own discipline, not a philosophy, but a science. Okay, so he is the father of modern psychology. Now, Stanley G. Hall worked under Wundt. He was an American, went to Germany, worked under William Wundt, and he took all the knowledge of his 15 years spent with Wundt and brought it back to America and started his own research laboratory at Johns Hopkins University and created the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, which is the governing force of psychology. He is also a major reason why psychology has taken off. The United States is one of the largest leading psychology-driven countries in the world, and we are actually one of the largest producing psychology forces in the world. Okay, and it's all thanks to Stanley G. Hall, who is the American father of psychology, worked under Wundt, brought it to the United States, opened the first American laboratory here, and is the reason why it took off in America. John B. Watson All right, we're going to be looking at a couple of his studies. He is the father of behaviorism, created the reaction to structuralism and functionalism. Both of those theories believe your behaviors are thought process and can only be analyzed by in your brain. Well, he believed that we should only be viewing behaviors because of the scientific observable aspect of it. All right, behaviorism is a theoretical orientation based on the premise that scientific psychology should be based on only observable behavior. Watson believed that we should not be assuming or guessing what's going on in the head. We should only be working with the clear science of what we're seeing. He believed that all psychology needs to be proven by science and create the science of behavior. We're going to see a very famous experiment by John B. Watson coming up in the next couple weeks. Ivan Pavlov is one of the most famous psychologists. He is a Russian psychologist who researched the physiology of digestion, which led to the major learning focus of classical conditioning. Most of his research was gathered studying the salivating dogs, which we'll go into much greater detail, heavily influenced by the behaviorist movement. He really believed that you should only be observing the behavior in which you see and not trying to assume that you can process what's actually going on inside the mind. Ivan Pavlov is a rock star of psychology, and you will get to know him very well. Sigmund Freud, he is definitely a major character in psychology. Even those of you who are maybe not so familiar with psychology, you definitely know the name Sigmund Freud. He focused on mental illness and treating people with psychological problems by using his own created psychoanalysis. He introduced the idea of the unconscious. Okay, he's the one who believes the id, the ego, okay, the superego. We're going to go into much greater detail. He was a genius in his own right, and then led astray by his own genius. And we're going to talk about how he came into fame in psychology and how he fell out of fame as well. Very interesting man, and we'll be talking about him in much greater detail coming up. B.F. Skinner, all right, very, very, very famous man. All right, we'll be talking about him when we talk about learning as well. He believed that stimulus and environmental factors mold behavior, that it's your environment that shapes how you behave, not your internal desires. Believed that psychology could predict behavior without resorting to physiological explanations. What that means is if we set up a scenario, we could shape your behavior and we could predict it without trying to figure out what's going on inside your head. He was a behaviorist as well. He did not believe psychologists should be trying to figure out what's going on in the head. We should be trying to explain your behaviors. He believed in positive responses. People and animals respond to positive responses, and that people desire positive responses. Okay, he used lots of animals and humans to prove. We'll be seeing plenty of his experiments and talking about his theories to much greater detail. B.F. Skinner. All right, Mary Winton Calkin, she's a pioneer. She's the first generation of women to enter psychology. Okay, she graduated very early. She was one of the first women to receive her PhD. She opened one of the first psychological laboratories in the United States at Wellesley College, which is still there in the United States. In Massachusetts, she kept her facility position until 49 years later, which is unheard of. She studied memory, groundbreaking research on dreams, development of a form of self-psychology. All right. She also became the first female president of American Psychological Association and the American Philosophical Association. Sorry. All right. We'll be talking to her to some great detail about her memory and thinking and research on dreams. She is one of the first women to truly succeed in psychology. Today, psychology is actually one of the larger fields where women are actually creeping up to becoming, to be up to about half of the PhDs as men do. So psychology, although it started as a male-dominated field, has turned into almost a 50-50 playing field, which is pretty exciting. Charles Darwin, although he's mostly known for his biology and his Darwinism and his evolution, he does play a major role in psychology, a major foundation. Okay, he laid the foundations for the theories of evolution, as well as the theory that we have evolved from cavemen and that our traits of our behavior are not just built for our world today, but built for, centuries ago. His book, The Origins of Species, is used obviously in science as well as psychology to help shape and explain our behaviors. Darwin's theory that we have evolved possibly from apes allowed people to see human behavior through an animal perspective, which caused much drama, however allows for a very insightful glimpse into our own background. Dorothea Dix, a very, very, very famous humanitarian. She was a newspaper reporter, and she wrote publications about the mistreatment of mental asylums and how they abuse their patients, and she believed that mentally handicapped and mentally ill patients needed to have higher care. All right, so she's one of the major reasons why our jails and mental asylums in North America are shaped the way they are, rather than in the negative format that they were in the 1920s and 1930s. William James was a pioneering American psychologist and philosopher. He wrote about young science of psychology and the psychology of religious experience, mysticism, and philosophy of pragmatism. We're going to be talking about him, especially as we get going through the cognition, the belief of our intelligence and how it's passed down. He has some really interesting theories that we'll get into more detail. Jean Piaget, we're going to be speaking a lot about him through our learning. He developed stages of learning for children, okay? The intellectual and cognitive development of children. At certain levels, children can handle this. At certain levels, at certain ages, they can do this. At certain ages, they can do that. And he is a very famous figure in learning and in the education system, as well as in psychology. Jean Piaget was a very interesting man. French, isn't he the cutest little thing you've ever seen? And we're going to be focused on him for language development, intellectual and cognitive development, as well as language development as well. Okay, Margaret Floyd Washburn, okay, she is best known for experimental work on animal behavior and motor theory development. She was the first woman to be granted a PhD in psychology. She was a major part of the developmental progression of life. We're going to be talking about her when we go through development. Very influential, as well as a great breaker of tradition of psychology. Was an all-male profession. And that's it.